All right, so let's go ahead and we'll do this. So again, we're just don't use a Dremel tool. Again, you'll just take off far too much material, and you'll probably render the chassis unusable. So just hold it between your thumb and your forefinger. You're just going to insert this into the bushing carrier area, and you're going to just use a slight twisting motion. And as you do that, you'll feel the diamond burrs there on the bit. You'll feel them making contact with the plastic and removing some of that plastic. I'm just twisting it very slowly, and at the same time I'm pushing toward the center of the chassis. Again, I'm just going back and forth, and eventually it just worked its way through. Again, we're just trying to take out a little bit of plastic, and you'll actually see a black ring of plastic. May not be visible on the camera, but on the bit where it's removed that. So we're not trying to take out large amounts of plastic, just enough for that burr bit so that it goes through and it spins freely. I'll turn the chassis around, and we'll repeat the same process on the other side for the other bushing carrier. Again, I'm going to twist it, just twist it and push it. And again, I'm not trying to force it through there. Twist it in, and then it finally goes through. Again, I can see some more plastic on the burr bit. Okay, and I'll remove the burr bit. So at this point, the bushing carriers have been enlarged slightly, and they're ready to go ahead and install the bushings. Now, when we install the bushings, again, if you're using a plain bushing, it doesn't really matter, which way you put it on the pin gauge. In this particular case, since I'm using these racing bushings that I offer on this particular chassis, I like to install them on the pin gauge with the counterboard side of the bushing facing toward the outside of the pin gauge, toward the ends of the pin gauge. And the reason I do this is once it's installed in this particular chassis, once we've got everything assembled and put back together again, I find that it's easier to lubricate the bushings without taking the car apart if the counterbore is pointing toward the outside of the chassis. Now, before I actually line this up and get ready to install it, there's one other thing that I'd like to point out, and that is normally what I would do here is I would go ahead and I would install the motor into the chassis. I would snap it in place, adjust it, and then I would secure it with some hot glue or goop or whatever you use for that purpose. And the reason for that is when you do that, the holder for the motor is adjacent to the holders for those bushing carriers. In some cases it'll expand or just bend that a little bit. So I want any of that flex or any of the twisting that's going to take place as a result of inserting the motor into the chassis, I want that to take place before I install my bushings. If I install the bushings first and then install the motor, it's possible that as a result of installing the motor, it might twist and the chassis, the bushing carriers ever so slightly, and just cause some misalignment. For purposes of this video and for clarity, I have not installed the motor so that you can see hopefully more clearly the steps to install those bushings and align them in the carrier. Okay, but again, if you're doing this for real, go ahead and install your motor into the chassis and secure it in place with your favorite adhesive. Okay, so that said, the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and we're going to space the bushings on the pin gauge. And you'll notice, by the way, if you slide these back and forth, the bushings on the pin gauge, they don't slide back and forth, nor does the pin gauge spin or rotate as freely within them as if you had an axle. And again, this is because the tolerances are much, much tighter between the pin gauge and the inside of that bushing. That's intentional. It will spin. It does spin freely, but again, it's not as free as if you had a 3/32 axle there. So we're going to align the bushings and the carriers over the bushing carriers, and I'll just see if I can bring that up. At this point, I haven't inserted them down into the bushing carriers. I've just positioned the bushings. I've spaced them out on that pin gauge so that they're directly over the bushing carriers, and I'm ready to insert the bushings down into the chassis. Now, this next step is very important. When you actually insert those bushings into the chassis, you need to be careful how you do that. What you don't want to do is you don't want to press down on the outside ends of this pin gauge, nor do you want to push down on the portion of the pin gauge that's between the bushings. If you do that, you're almost certain to bend that pin gauge. If you bend the pin gauge, then you're defeating the whole purpose of having this precision, nice straight pin gauge to align your bushings. If that pin gauge gets bent, then by definition your bushings are not going to be in perfect alignment. All right, so what we're going to do instead, I find is most effective, is we're going to push down from the top, directly on top of these bushings, using our thumbs, and we're going to seat those bushings into the bushing carriers in that fashion. So again, I'm not going to push down directly on the pin gauge. I'm going to press those into place firmly using my thumbs. Now I'm going to try not to block this. I'll do the best I can, but unfortunately it will get blocked somewhat. So again, I'm just putting some pressure on those bushings. I'm pressing straight down, and you'll generally hear them snap into the bushing carriers. All right. So at this point, the bushings have been installed into the bushing carriers on each side. They've been snapped in. Just double check, make sure that they're in the right position. So then the next thing that I want to do is I want to spin this pin gauge. All right, and in this particular case, again, you have to keep in mind it's not going to spin as freely as a 3/32 axle once you put the axle in there, because the tolerances are tighter. On the other hand, sometimes when you put these in, you won't be able to spin the pin gauge initially, or it'll be very, very difficult to take quite a bit of force, with your thumb and your forefinger to spin this. If that's the case, this is a somewhat iterative process in many cases. What you'll want to do is go ahead and press down again. Repeat that process of pressing down on top of those bushings. Test until you spin it. And generally what will happen is each time that you press down on those bushings, the alignment will improve, and it'll be easier and easier to turn the pin gauge inside the bushings. Once you've got it to the point, and again, it's a little bit of trial and error. The more you do this, you kind of get a feel for what's aligned and what's a reasonable amount of force to spin this. But this is spinning pretty freely at this point, so I really don't need to do any further alignment on this. It feels pretty good. So then.